Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome back again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville news, government, politics, business, education, really anything that gets our attention. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass, which you can find at CompassKnox.com, joined as always by Scott Barker, also co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing today, Scott?
Oh, I'm doing just fine. I think the bigger question is, how are you doing?
Well, I'm zooming in remotely because, last week we talked a little bit about, I had just come back from this great European vacation, like seemingly half of America is taking, if judging from my Facebook feed. And also, like several of my friends who have been traveling this summer, I brought home a little gift with me, which was my second bout of COVID. I tested positive a couple of days ago. Just to let the listeners know, I'm totally fine. Scott, you and I shared a bout of COVID along with our producer, Seth, last year, and we were all a little bit unhappy from that, had some fever and didn't feel great. This time around, for whatever reason, it really just feels like a mild summer cold, just basically inconvenient. And of course, it means I cannot be there with you all because I decided to keep it to myself.
Well, thank you for that.
Yes, I appreciate it as well.
Yeah, it's funny. We track the COVID numbers for Knox County every week, and for the last several weeks, they've been it's been really suppressed, and I believe you took a home test, so your case is not counted in the official case count, but they're way low. The hospitalizations are almost non-existent.
Yep. People are practically not thinking about it anymore. And, when I was on my trip, certainly we went all over the place. We didn't wear any masks. I saw, a handful of people here and there wearing masks, but mostly not. Honestly, I went all over Europe, but my prime suspect in this, not that we can ever really know, is my very last flight from Chicago back to Knoxville. I was toward the back of the plane. There's one guy sitting right behind me, just like hacking and wheezing all the way through the flight. And I just thought, like, seriously, dude, maybe you should be wearing a mask. He wasn't. So I'm going to blame it on him, whether it's his fault or not. But yeah, it is still out there, obviously. But also, most of the people who I know who have had it in the last few months, it has also been these relatively mild cases. That could just be the variant that's around. It could be because we all have vaccinations and we have, immunity from having had it. Who knows? But for now, all it really means is a little bit of inconvenience. So we will deal with it and carry on with our show.
Yeah, I'm glad it appears to be mild. So good for you.
Well, so we do have some things to talk about this week, even though it was not a super active week, what with it being the 4th of July and kind of a week where not much was really happening in any official realms that we cover, apart from fireworks. But we have a couple of campaign updates on the city races that are shaping up ahead of the August primary, an interesting study on gun deaths in Tennessee by the Sycamore Institute, an interesting survey about faculty and student attitudes towards freedom of expression at the University of Tennessee, a hint that maybe sometime in the who knows how distant future, Knoxville might once again see passenger rail service. And to start us all off, Scott, I thought we should start by following up on something that we first talked about on last week's episode, because when we recorded that, this had literally just happened. But of course, there was the resignation of Brooklyn Belk, deputy chief at the Knoxville Police Department, after just 4 months on the job. We talked about it a little bit last week. You wrote about it this week. Still some unanswered questions here, but kind of at this point, what do we know about this?
Well, the primary thing is the city hired Belk as the first deputy chief of professional standards. It's a civilian role as opposed to she doesn't have to be. You don't have to be a sworn officer to be in there. You do have to be an attorney. She was a former prosecutor. Great fanfare when she was hired in February. They talked about how qualified she was. She had a lot of experience in the same kinds of things they wanted her to do, which is she had two kind of main thrusts to her job. One was to develop policies and procedures and refine those for Chief Paul Noel, who, as we frequently point out, has kind of came here with a reputation for being a reformer and has been making a lot of changes. This was one of those changes, and also she's in charge of the internal affairs portion of their duties. In fact, the internal affairs unit no longer is called the internal affairs unit. It's just part of the Office of Professional Standards. Like I said, great fanfare, a lot of hype around her hiring, and then 4 months later she resigns. I mean, it's just pretty abrupt. The city, both the police department, Chief Noel, and Mayor India Kincannon, said, well, it was a temporary thing all along. It was we expected this. It was basically she wasn't hired for the long term. The big problem with that is they never mentioned that when they hired her. The kind of
and you wouldn't normally give such a big hoopla to somebody who you thought was only going to be there for such a short time.
Yeah, and and one of the things that makes that kind of ironic is the whole point of having the Office of Professional Standards, and a lot of what Noel has talked about has been increasing transparency. And they mentioned that when they hired her at the press conference where they hired her in February. Transparency has been a big point of emphasis, and then all of a sudden, this kind of it looks like they weren't transparent about this only being a temporary hire. So it kind of
or about the actual reasons for her departure,
or the reasons for their departure. The other part of this is there really weren't reasons given other than it was going to be temporary all along. She didn't say, and she hasn't been available for comment, is that she didn't say in the press release that she was leaving for another position, that she had another anything else lined up, which is what usually happens when this type of scenario. So, and obviously retirement is out of the question. She's young. She's only there 4 months. It's not like, that was part of it, but, so that was a little strange. It raises a lot of questions about why. There's a lot of speculation about, things going on behind the scenes that nobody knows about. And I've heard a lot of them. I've talked to a lot of people about various things. I don't want to just, spout off rumors that I've heard and perpetuate the rumors. A lot of them are not, proved to be unfounded. So I'm glad.
Right. You've chased some rumors and been able to at least determine that those weren't the explanations, even if we're still not sure what the total situation is.
Right. One of the things that I think can be said is that the internal affairs portion of this job has turned out to be pretty big, and there's been a couple of high-profile cases that, I mean, she walked right into the Lisa Edwards case, which was very controversial. She was the woman who died after being in police custody. She died of natural causes, but the video of her encounter with KPD officers was quite disturbing, and several of them got the officers involved were investigated and were disciplined, but it took a while. There was a lot of anger toward the police department about that incident, and so I don't know how much that played into it, because most of her experience beforehand had been in more of a policy and training aspect of it. But I don't want to speculate too much on how heavily that weighed on. There could be other reasons that haven't even been subject of rumor that could be about it. Yeah.
Well, and I think, we see these things happen sometimes where somebody gets hired for a high profile job and then they leave, and the answer is always some version of it didn't work out.
Yeah.
And that can be because the expectations of the person being hired aren't the same as the people doing the hiring, or vice versa. It can be for any number of reasons. It can be personal reasons that come up. Right, we do see these things. The thing that strikes me about this is that, especially given that so much of her role was going to be about really kind of fostering this culture change in the department that Chief Noel has made such a focus, that is never going to be an easy thing to do in a police department. The fact that somebody who is brought in kind of with that mandate leaves after 4 months, I mean, you can't say anything in particular about it except that that challenge clearly remains, I guess, and that I know they are planning to fill either that position or some position like it, right? They really kind of wrote that job description, it seems like, for her in particular. Yeah,
it does kind of seem that way in retrospect, especially. They have said they're going to be looking for someone. It's they're going to do a nationwide search. It's going to be, as I said, it doesn't have to be a sworn police officer. It does need to be, as this job description is written, it does need to be someone who is an attorney. And the deputy chief jobs, and those are the positions directly under the chief. They report to the chief, and that's it. They can come from outside the department. Most other promotions come from within the department. There's civil service rules, yada yada, on that. But these positions can come from any department or any law enforcement agency anywhere. So, and in this case, any attorney anywhere can apply. And you talked about the culture change. I mean, one of the changes they made has been to those the officers responsible for internal affairs investigations. The internal affairs unit, when Noel came on board, we've talked about this before, when he came on board versus what it is now 1 year later, there's only one investigator left doing internal affairs investigations. The others have either retired or been transferred or quit. One famously officer quit and wrote a scathing letter about the changes. So, that was disseminated publicly, and we reported on it, and it's not it's very clear that in some instances, at least, the reforms and the culture change that Noel wants to institute have not been well received, at least in some quarters. Noel claims that the vast majority of the officers have embraced them, but obviously it's not 100%.
Right. Well, and police departments nationwide are notoriously resistant to change. They tend to be institutionally conservative in all sorts of ways. And that may be what part of what Noel is running up against, but obviously we'll just continue to monitor as it goes.
Yep.
Okay, well, let's shift gears or change tracks. Scott, you wrote a little thing this week about a study that came out about rail service. And of course, anybody familiar with American history and Knoxville history will know that at one point in this country, we had really good passenger rail service. You could take a train from just about anywhere to anywhere else. In Knoxville 100 years ago, you could have gotten on a train and gone to Atlanta, gone to Chattanooga, any number of places. And of course, now you can't catch a passenger train within, I don't know, what's the closest place here? Greenville, South Carolina, maybe? Atlanta? You can catch trains there.
Maybe, yeah, Atlanta, definitely. So, yeah.
So what's the prospect here? What did this study look at, and what does it suggest?
Well, this study was conducted by the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, which is called TACIR, TACIR. And they obviously look at intergovernmental relations in the state of Tennessee. The legislature asked them to look at rail service in our state. One of the things that they came up with some recommendations. But one of them is to establish a passenger rail service office within the Department of Transportation, which right now we only have one section of passenger rail goes from it's the city of New Orleans line from New Orleans to Chicago, runs through Memphis and West Tennessee. But there is a study underway or under consideration for a line that would run from Atlanta to Nashville through Chattanooga. And this study recommends, and another one from Memphis to Nashville. And this study recommends that the state get behind those efforts. They have to go through the Federal Railroad Commission. They have a corridor program, identification program, which identifies where passenger rail could possibly go in the future. The Atlanta to Nashville route has a lot of kind of support behind it. Atlanta already has Amtrak service, so it would just be an easy connection. And then Nashville, of course, has undergone tremendous amount of growth in the last couple of decades. The population is getting to the point where, they could probably handle that. It's enough of a destination. There's enough business that goes on between Nashville, Chattanooga, and Atlanta to justify it. Of course, nobody in Knoxville really cares right now, because what people around here are concerned about is passenger rail service in Knoxville. Well, the third line that this report said the state should get behind and provide funding to and go after this corridor identification funding, which is how this. It's a long process, but the feds help fund the investigation into whether a corridor will work. This would go from Chattanooga to Knoxville to Bristol, and and you kind of scratch your head. Well, you can see a line ending in Nashville, maybe not in Bristol. But the state of Virginia is considering extending passenger rail service to Bristol, Virginia. So as we all know, Bristol is a town divided. Essentially, it's two towns, but one on the Tennessee side, one on the Virginia side, and so those lines could feasibly hook up there. It would give a connection from Knoxville to the Northeast Corridor, which is where the vast majority of rail service is in the United States. So they recommended kind of looking at that corridor. It's the number 3 on the priority list. Obviously, the Atlanta to Chattanooga to Nashville line is number 1. Memphis to Nashville is number 2. This is number 3. And all it would be doing would be to look at the feasibility of doing this. Now, there are huge hurdles into doing this.
Right, because it would be using existing rail networks, right? But those are currently owned and operated by the freight rail services.
Right, they're owned and operated by freight, Norfolk Southern and CSX here locally. And that's the way it is everywhere in the country, just about. So they would have to partner with the private rail lines to use their lines, their routes, which they routinely do, and they can work out the logistics of all that. But the railroad companies have said there need to be upgrades to their lines if this is going to happen. In many cases, that would require adding a second rail line in the same right of way, but a second, have dual tracks. So obviously, you don't want a passenger rail train. You don't want a passenger train colliding with a freight train, which has tragic consequences every time it happens. So it's not. So you need that infrastructure. And there's some issues with that. I mean, the Chattanooga to Nashville line, for example, where it goes, there's a spot where it has about a 4/10 of a mile tunnel, which was built before the Civil War. It's enough room barely for one line through the mountains down there, and so that's a choke point where there has to be some logistical, probably would have to be some logistical adjustments made and infrastructure adjustments. And also using the existing rail network is one reason that a Nashville to Knoxville route isn't being considered, because there is no direct freight line from Nashville to Knoxville. You can go
because of a little thing called the Cumberland Plateau.
Yeah, you can go. There are rail lines that go from. You can get from Knoxville up to like Morgan County, for example, and the rail lines on the eastern edge of the plateau go. Follow the edge of the plateau. They're kind of northeast, southwest configured lines. None of them connect to the lines that go east from Nashville. They end just east of Cookeville. In Monterey, I believe is, and I'm not sure that the line from Cookeville to Monterey is even still alive. I don't think it's even used, but there's a rail line there, and getting from, and I'm not sure exactly where in the northeastern part of the plateau, maybe Livingston or Jamestown, from that area over to Cookeville is rugged terrain. They would have to buy right of way, or have to obtain right of way, and which would be very expensive. And the rails, there's no benefit for rail services or the freight services, or they would have already done it. So not going to happen anyway. And also, I mean, and this kind of gets into the cost of doing this. And it's an astronomical cost. Actually, they didn't break it down in here and give like complete dollars and cents. But if you've got to do infrastructure improvements on the rail lines, you'd have to build train stations. I mean, Knoxville had 2 train stations back in the days of passenger travel that you talked about. The Southern station, which was over on Depot, and it's been reused. The L&N station, which is at World's Fair Park, is now a school.
My son is a student there.
Yeah,
you can't catch a train at that building.
No, so I mean, there's that kind of infrastructure. There's also the infrastructure of actually buying, the trains. They've got to do that. So there are a lot of big upfront costs, and Amtrak doesn't. If a line's less than 750 miles, they don't pay. The feds don't pay for it. So it'd be state funding. All these big upfront costs, plus wherever passenger rail is in service, there are subsidies, because the tickets don't cover all of the the cost. So there's a huge tab that will go along with doing this if it gets done. And the report's kind of funny and it's really not emphasized in there, but they do kind of go, oh, by the way, since it does take so many years and it is so expensive, you might want to think about establishing inner-city bus service instead. Mm-hmm. Of course, we have.
Right, which is we've talked about that here recently because, of course, for years and years, we had relatively reliable inner-city bus service. We had the Greyhound station downtown, but as anyone who's been following it knows, there's been a lot of changes to Greyhound service. They no longer have a station in Knoxville. They're dropping people off in a parking lot in East Knoxville. A lot of people unhappy about that. And so I guess this would be, and that's a private company doing that, obviously. I guess this would be looking at whether there's need for a publicly funded service, right?
Yeah. And that would be, that it obviously entails more cost too, but not nearly as much as rail. And it would be definitely easier to regulate as far as bus stations and that sort of thing. So there is talk in the real official channels, not just on social media about or in bars in Knoxville or where it's not a complete fantasy to talk about passenger rail. The reality is still remote. Like you said at the beginning, it's way in the future if it happens at all. So,
right. All right. Well, fun to think about anyway.
Oh, absolutely.
The University of Tennessee conducted a survey of student and faculty, I guess, attitudes and thoughts about freedom of expression on campus. And this was something they were actually required to do by the legislature. And you wrote about this. It sounds like the findings maybe weren't quite what legislators were expecting or looking for when they ordered this.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before, very controversial divisive concepts act that the legislature passed 2 years ago, or 2 sessions ago, was, of course, it basically states that you can't force anyone on campus, whether it's student, faculty, staff, whatever, to adhere to certain concepts. This was put forward by the Republican supermajority. There was a lot of talk at the time that conservative voices were being squelched on campus, that it was this was a way to prevent liberal indoctrination. It was primarily aimed at students, I think, but also faculty members, less so staff. I mean, it's but it did include staff. So this whole narrative had been put forward that Tennessee's colleges and universities were, basically places where you couldn't speak out if you were conservative. So this was approved a party line vote. It was very controversial in academia, as you might expect. There were protests at UT, all kinds of things going on. Part of that law mandated this that schools do a biennial study on or poll of their campus climate. This was the University of Tennessee's, and it was a system-wide study done by Gallup, and basically found that students and faculty overwhelmingly said across all campuses that UT welcomes freedom of expression. That they weren't,
and both among liberals, conservatives,
among everybody. Yeah, they first brought up everybody. And basically, I'm going to round figures horribly for people who listen who like minutia, but 9 out of 10 students, faculty, staff, all taken together, 9 out of 10 across the system said UT, their campus at UT welcomes diverse thought, and you can express your opinions. So it was really 1 out of 10 that and of those, now it's of those, only a majority or a minority felt they couldn't express their opinions. So it was real, and it was basically across ideological lines. I mean, it was pretty much just as many conservatives as liberals on the ends of the spectrum thought that. And of course, the closer you get to the middle, they divided the spectrum from very conservative or conservative, leans conservative, moderate, leans liberal. The three in the middle had, they very much asserted that campuses were had no problem. They had no problems with expressing their opinions, and didn't. It wasn't a big deal to them. Apparently, it is on, like I said, on either end of the spectrum, which is what you might expect. They divided this study also up into individual campuses. As my guess, since the University of Tennessee Knoxville is the by far the largest campus in the system, it mirrored, the numbers pretty much mirrored those of the statewide survey. The only place where there was much of a difference, and it really wasn't much overall, was of those who said, the faculty members who said that it wasn't that free speech wasn't encouraged or was discouraged at campuses. A quarter of quarter of conservative faculty members said that it was. 1/3. Excuse me. I'm got to go back and forth. There are a lot of numbers in the survey. 1/3 of the conservative faculty members who didn't think you could speak out well at UT were concerned about expressing their own opinions. And a quarter of
that's 1/3 of a minority.
Yeah, and 1/4 of a minority liberals said the same thing. There were some other kind of interesting little tidbits in there. The students especially were more reluctant to express themselves, their opinions, in class or in on-campus activities of whatever sort, non-classroom activities. They felt freer to express themselves at off-campus events or club activities, in organizational activities. And that kind of makes sense. And the consultant they had from Gallup said, yeah, that makes sense, because when you're in class, you're concerned about what your instructor is going to think and how that's going to affect your grade.
Well, and also just a lot of people, I mean, certainly I remember from my own college days, you'd have these wide-ranging discussions in the classroom, and often it was the same 6 or 7 people. I was often one of them, not surprisingly.
Surely not.
Because a lot of people just don't like speaking up in public, period, whatever their political orientation. A lot of people don't have that comfort level. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's because, your professor's a raving Marxist or an Austrian economic conservative and you don't want to challenge them. A lot of people just don't like speaking up.
Yeah, absolutely. But the one thing is too that they mentioned is the places where they feel more comfortable, off-campus events or clubs and on-campus organizations, you're basically going to be around like-minded people, and you feel more comfortable expressing yourself than you might if raising your opinion leads to an argument or whatever. Anyway, so this survey basically can be read to look at to kind of undermine the foundation behind the divisive concepts law, and it's funny when that law was passed, President Randy Boyd at the university said it won't really affect. The faculty were all up in arms about it, or a lot of them were, and Boyd was saying it won't affect us because we always have allowed free expression. he was, it was almost kind of a blasé thing. Who cares about this law? He didn't say that, but he was kind of the impression you got was he just was completely unconcerned about the law. Now, when this report came out at the Board of Trustees annual meeting at one of the committee meetings, and had a presentation on this, and Boyd, now, Board of Trustees meetings, it's almost a love fest between the trustees and the governor and the legislature because they provide so much financial support. They can't go 15 minutes without expressing appreciation to the legislature and the governor for supporting various programs and initiatives at the university, which is understandable. And when Boyd addressed this survey, he did not mention the law. He did not mention the legislature when talking about it, but he obviously took great pleasure in pointing out that it was, I was right all along, or we were right all along. He wasn't taking personal credit, but this isn't a surprise. This validates what we were saying all along, in that free expression is encouraged and at the University of Tennessee, at all of the campuses at the University of Tennessee, and really looking at the numbers, it's kind of hard to argue that.
Yeah. Well, frankly, shouldn't really be surprising to anybody. This is the University of Tennessee. It is in Tennessee. Most of its students come from Tennessee. The notion that our state university system was somehow a hotbed of Marxist dogma and indoctrination, and especially for you and I are on campus for various things. We know people who work there. We know people whose kids are students there. So it seemed a little bit unlikely.
Yeah, it's you kind of, this whole idea that the university is always a political battleground just doesn't hold true. I mean, those of us who went to college can think back. Most of the time, we're talking about where the next kicker is going to be, or the next ball game. If we're not,
and most of your time in class is not spent on political philosophy, unless you're taking a political philosophy class.
Yeah, it was kind of funny. One of the when this debate was going on, one of the funny things was State Senator Frank Nosley talked about how he was told he would fail a class because he's conservative, and when he was at the University of Tennessee, and State Senator Becky Duncan Massey from Knoxville said that her brother was told by a professor that he would fail his class because he was a conservative, and the professor presumably was liberal and all. Of course, the odd thing about that is Senator Frank Nosley, State Senator Frank Nosley, he became a state senator. It didn't really harm his political career at all. And Becky Massey's brother served in the U.S. Congress for longer than a quarter century. So that was Jimmy Duncan. And so,
and that is also always the question with these things is it's like, is it actually bad for students to be exposed to ideas they might not agree with? Like, isn't that also part of the college experience? And
that was a question in the survey as well. And the vast majority of students said that yes, they were routinely exposed to people with different ideas than they had, which is, as is part of the college experience. And you test. You go into college as a freshman, you've got, a lot of people already have their, they've got beliefs and ideas about the world. And those beliefs and ideas are tested by meeting other people and talking about other ideas. And sometimes those ideas and beliefs are validated, and sometimes you wind up questioning them.
Sure.
And that is the college experience. So,
and part of growing up.
And part of growing up. Yes.
I guess so. They'll do that survey again in a couple of years. Is the idea? So we'll see if there's any.
Yeah, they'll do it in a couple of years. The other schools in the state also have to do the same. They're doing the same thing. Middle Tennessee State, Tennessee Tech, yada yada. So I did not look at those. I just only looked at UT Knoxville and the University of Tennessee system. But it would be kind of interesting to take a look at those and see how they compare.
All right. Well, let's talk about another study that came out that we wrote about this week. This has to do with firearms deaths in Tennessee. The Sycamore Institute, which is a nonpartisan think tank in Nashville. And, I think we should say that think tanks usually call themselves nonpartisan think tanks. That doesn't necessarily mean that they may be nonpartisan, but they're not always non-ideological. So, for example, in Tennessee, we have the Beacon Center, which everybody knows is a quite conservative think tank, even though it's officially nonpartisan. Think Tennessee is a bit more sort of center progressive think tank. The Sycamore Institute really is I would say, the closest thing that we have in Tennessee to a just kind of straight down the middle public policy institute. I think they really go out of their way to try to not reflect particular political or ideological perspectives. They are really very data driven. So with that background, what this study showed, they thought it would be interesting with all of the talk around gun violence and gun deaths in Tennessee. And of course, Governor Bill Lee, having said that he's going to call a special session of the legislature to look at these issues again, although he hasn't yet actually officially done that, still a little bit up in the air, but he says he's going to in August. So the Sycamore Institute thought that it would be helpful to everybody to just look at the numbers. What do we know about firearms deaths in Tennessee? And so they crunched the available data, and these come from cause of death reports that are filed by, local officials across the country to state officials, who then submit them all to the feds and comes through the Centers for Disease Control. And so they're using that set of data. And what they found is that in the last decade in Tennessee, we have seen a really significant increase in both total numbers, but also rates of firearms deaths in Tennessee. And, it was interesting. They actually looked back 20 years. They used 1999 as a starting point and went through 2021, which is the most recent year that data is available. And what they found was the first decade of that period, from 1999 to about 2010, 2011, there really wasn't much change. I think in 1999, there were 848 total firearms deaths in the state. In 2011, there were about 948. So it went up about 100. But once you adjust for the growth of population in the state during that decade, it was really only about a 1% rise in the actual rate of gun deaths. So kind of flat for about 10 years. And then in the last 10 years, a big jump. So from about 948 in 2011 to 1,569 in 2021. That's a 66% increase in the numbers. Once you adjust for population growth during that time, it's still a 52% increase in the rate. So a greater than 50% increase in the rate of gun deaths in the state over the past 10 years. And a couple of interesting things about that. Now, they are looking at both suicides and homicides and accidents, basically all deaths where firearms are the actual cause of death. And suicides for the period from 1999 to 2011 made up the majority of firearms deaths, in the vicinity of about 60% or so. More than 60% of all firearms deaths were in the state were suicides during that period. Now, for the past 10 years, suicides still make up a majority, but just barely. 52% of all gun deaths in that period were suicides. in 2021, the most recent year, 52% were suicides, 46% were homicides. So there's been a big jump in homicides. Basically, both gun-related suicides and gun-related homicides went up during that period. But the increase in suicides was about 25%. The increase in homicides was 113%. So fairly significant increase, and particularly in homicides, some very different demographic effects in terms of where you see that. Maybe not surprisingly, given other things we know about health trends and so forth in the U.S. Suicides tend to be concentrated among older people over the age of 35. They're heavily concentrated among men and also heavily concentrated among white men. Scott, you and I are in the demographic that middle-aged white men are the most common demographic for all suicides and for gun-related suicides. And also, guns make up the majority of suicides in the state. About 68% of all suicides in Tennessee are committed with guns. Homicides are concentrated among younger demographics, people between 19 and 34, and much more prominent among African Americans, particularly Black men. And another thing that they found was that even though gun deaths among people under 19 in the age range from like 1 to 18, that's the smallest number of gun deaths overall, but it's also the demographic that saw the biggest increase during that period. And we've talked before about how gun deaths now are the leading cause of death across the country for people 18 years and younger. And that happened in about 2020 was when it went from being car accidents to gun-related deaths for young people. In Tennessee, we actually made that jump a little earlier, starting in 2017. Every year since 2017, firearms have been the leading cause of death in Tennessee for people between the ages of 1 and 18. About 3/4 of those are concentrated in the age range of 15 to 18, which kind of tracks, with what we've seen. Certainly anecdotally here, we've seen some very high-profile shooting deaths in Knoxville in that age group in recent years. And so that's what the numbers show. And if you're curious about how Tennessee ranks against the rest of the country, we have a lot more gun deaths than most of the rest of the country. We rank 11th overall in our rate of gun deaths. We rank 7th for homicide deaths in the country. Sometimes you'll hear, and especially some of our politicians like to rail about, violence in blue states and in blue cities. And they talk about Chicago, they talk about New York City. Tennessee has higher rates of gun deaths than any of those states. And yes, it is to some degree concentrated in our urban areas, but actually the counties in Tennessee that have the highest rates of gun deaths, only of the major metro areas in Tennessee, only Shelby County, Memphis is in the top 5 in terms of rates of gun deaths, with the rest of them being mostly West Tennessee rural counties that have those very high rates. So, I talked to the executive director of the Sycamore Institute about this, and, he was very clear that they weren't looking at causes of this. They weren't trying to say why this has happened. And they also weren't trying to delineate policy solutions to it. They were really just trying to set the table and say, if you want to talk about gun deaths and gun violence in Tennessee, kind of here's where we're at, here's where you see the impacts, and maybe that can help shape, an informed policy discussion.
Yeah, that was one of the things that struck me about this is that oftentimes these studies come out and they make recommendations. Like the rail study, for example, which is obviously a completely different kind of study. But this one, basically says, okay, if we're going to talk about gun deaths, we're going to talk about gun violence, here are the numbers, and go forth and make good policy. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one thing that is often lacking in these discussions is, okay, what do the numbers actually say? What, and then we can, take a look at policies that can actually address what's really happening, as opposed to what you think might happen, what happened 20 years ago, that sort of thing. So I think that this is it's a valuable exercise for civic discussion.
Hey, I want to interrupt real quick, guys. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I haven't got a chance to read the whole thing from the Sycamore Institute. I did get a copy of it, but are officer-related shooting deaths counted? Or do they delineate?
I think.
Yeah, they're not separated out.
They're not separated out. I'm sure they're included, but those are going to be they get a lot of attention when they happen.
Sure.
But that's going to be a very, very small number of these in any given year. But sure, those would be included in the overall data.
But it's not delineated as a subset of the different sets of them?
No, they would probably fall into, because they track homicides, suicides, and then accident/other. And so anything that's not ruled a homicide or a suicide is probably going to fall into that other category. That's only about 2% of all deaths, and that includes accidents. So, things like not just officer related, but, things that are found to be, for example, justified shootings, and anything that's not classed as a homicide or suicide is going to fall into that category. But all of those together is only about 2%. So it's a very, very small part of the picture.
Right. I think that's 30 total, give or take. 30 total is what the stat reads to me of the unintentionals.
Yeah, probably. But again, that's going to include, things like 4-year-olds picking up a gun and accidentally shooting their sister or whatever. It's not just things involving law enforcement. But yeah, I think that one of the interesting things about it is that sort of Second Amendment enthusiasts, gun rights advocates, often balk at including suicides in these kinds of discussions. They kind of often seem to say that suicides shouldn't count as gun deaths because they're a separate category. But it's interesting that if you look at the states that have the highest rates of gun-related suicides, they also often have high rates of gun-related homicides. They also often have high rates of overall gun ownership. The Sycamore Institute study didn't look at gun ownership rates, but there was a study that came out just a year or two ago by the Rand Corporation that did look at that across the country. And it's interesting, if you look at the states that have the highest rates of gun ownership, many of them, say the top 20 states in gun ownership, many of them, not all of them, but many of them are also in the top 20 states for gun deaths, gun homicides, gun suicides. Tennessee has higher rates of both gun homicide and gun suicide than the rest of the country does. And so I think that to not treat suicide as if it is a public health issue, when we are seeing increases in suicide rates, not as high an increase as we're seeing in homicide rates, but we are seeing increase. I think that to some degree is, I don't know if it's dishonest, but it's maybe a disservice, because anybody, I have had friends who have died by suicide, and to say that those deaths are not traumatic to the family and friends and so forth, is not true. They are. And it doesn't necessarily, as Brian Strassel, the executive director of the Sycamore Institute, said, if you want to look at addressing both suicides and homicides, you're probably looking at somewhat different policy prescriptions, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't look at them, that it's not something that should be considered. So I guess we will see if that session actually gets called. A lot of Republicans in the legislature are putting pressure on the governor to not actually call it. I think a lot of them are not enthusiastic about going back to Nashville and being once again surrounded by demonstrators and protesters for gun safety regulation, as they were throughout the last month of the legislative session. But if they do come back, this study will probably be used by at least some legislators to kind of talk about, what do we do about this? All right. Well, let us move on to City of Knoxville elections. Just a couple of Odds and ends came up this week. I guess, Scott, let's start with we have one fewer candidate for mayor than we did a week ago.
Yes, we do. We had 5 candidates for mayor a week ago, and now we only have 4. Barack who is a business owner. He owns a business in Bearden, and he was running for mayor. And it turns out that he hasn't lived in Knoxville long enough to qualify to run for mayor. And so his name is not going to be on the ballot. The election commission voted to disqualify him as a candidate. So his name's not going to be included on the ballot. Everybody else in mayor's race, city council race, judge's races, those are all going to be on the ballot except for his. Turns out he lived just outside the city limits for several years. The last time he voted was last November. He voted using that address, the address that's outside the city limits on North Shore, and then he came in and changed his voter registration address to an address in Dean Hill, which is inside the city limits. But he only did that a month before the qualifying deadline ended, and the city charter says you've got to be a city resident for a year before the qualifying deadline comes up. So he did not.
So who does that leave us running for mayor?
That leaves us, obviously, Mayor India Kincannon is running for re-election. Mortgage lender Jeff Tallman is running against her, as is a police reform advocate Constance Every, and businessman R.C. Lawhorn. So those are the candidates left, and they will be moving forward. So far, only one of those candidates has been endorsed by a major group. That was by the East Tennessee Realtors, the organization formerly known as the Knoxville Area Realtors Association. They sent out their endorsements. It's endorsement season. We'll be getting a lot of these over the next few weeks. In several races, not all races, they endorsed Kincannon for mayor. They're also endorsing Councilwoman Lynn Fugit and her reelection bid for at-large seat A, and in at-large seat C, they're endorsing developer Tim Hill, who is challenging incumbent Amelia Parker, and also Matthew Best, who's the Change Center, is in that race as well.
Wait, the realtors endorsed a developer?
Yeah, that's kind of stunning. However, one of the interesting things is who they did not endorse. The realtors did not endorse a realtor. Because Fugit's opponent is Cameron Brooks, who's a realtor. For whatever reason, they talked about the reasons that they gave. Fugit is a former mortgage lender. I mean, she's very familiar with the industry, and they make no bones about the fact that they're looking at candidates who would best put forth policies that positively affect the real estate industry. I mean, they obviously make no bones about that. They made no bones about that in their press conference, and but they endorsed Fugit over Brooks, which was if they were just going to endorse candidates who were involved with them, I would have thought that you would think that it would be Brooks over Fugit, but no. And
they did something similar last year in the Knox County Commission races in the 3rd district. They endorsed Stuart Hall over Gina Oster, and Oster is also a realtor.
Yeah.
That being a realtor will not automatically get you the endorsement, obviously,
of the realtors. Yeah. And also they decided not to endorse in the at-large seat B race, which does not have an incumbent, because Janet Tesperman's not running for re-election. Debbie Helsley is running against R. Bentley Marlowe. Marlowe is a builder. Mm-hmm. So he is in the real estate business in that sense. And they did not endorse in that race. They just chose not to. And for whatever reason, they chose not to. And they also didn't endorse in the municipal judge race. They said they'd never do. Part of that's because it's almost never contested, but
right.
But they didn't make an endorsement in it. And of course, that's not a policy position anyway. It's just basically a city codes enforcement mechanism. So, but anyway,
Mayor Kincannon, who got that endorsement, she made an endorsement of her own, right?
She did. Last election, 2 years ago, she endorsed all of the incumbents. And if you recall, there was a whole slate of candidates put forward by the Knox County Republican Party in the city's nominally nonpartisan races. They all challenged incumbents. She endorsed the incumbents. The incumbents won, so, this time around, she is only so far and has no plans to endorse anybody else, has endorsed Fugit in her race against Cameron Brooks. Fugit is, so she's garnered a couple of big endorsements. One of the interesting things about that is 2 years ago, she, Kincannon endorsed all of the incumbents. This time around, there are three incumbents on the ballot. Fugit is on for seat A. Charlie Thomas is running unopposed in the 5th district. So of course nobody's going to endorse Thomas because why? He's not running against anybody. So poor guys is in some ways won't be feeling the love of as much as some of the others will, but he
also doesn't have to run much of a campaign.
But
so it's probably a trade-off.
Yeah, and when you're talking to him, he's okay with that.
Yeah.
But the other race involving an incumbent is the seat C race involving Hill and Best and Parker. Parker is the incumbent. Kincannon didn't endorse her. Didn't endorse anybody in that race, but pointedly didn't endorse her. That's really wouldn't be not to be. It isn't unexpected because Parker has been clashing with the administration since she was elected 4 years ago. She is the voice of the opposition on to the mayor's office on city council, and so it's not unusual.
Coming from sort of the left, from a social justice perspective.
Yes, coming from the left, and it's on council. There are the candidates who are the most. I think you would say Janet Testerman is probably the most conservative council member. She is a Republican. She ran for the state legislature last year as a Republican, and she, generally speaking, supports most of the administration's proposals. Now, the big exception was the budget last year. Of course, that was in the middle of her, and the tax increase last year. Other than that, she pretty much. I don't want to say has fallen in line with the administration, but pretty much aligns with the administration in most of their proposals. So
right, much more than Parker does.
Much more than Parker does. Parker almost never agrees with the administration on anything that could be perceived as an issue ripe for conflict. Obviously, and things like accepting grants and things like that, she's usually right in with everybody else and saying yes. But when it comes down to policy disputes, she's almost always on the side opposite the mayor. So,
and Kincannon didn't make an endorsement in that race, but she has made donations to both Tim Hill and Matthew Best, I think. So she may not be making an endorsement, but she's sort of making an unendorsement Parker, basically.
Yeah, essentially so. Yes, I think that's fair to say. Although she would not, she wouldn't go there. I mean, publicly, say I'm not going to. I'm hoping that she doesn't, that Parker doesn't win. I don't think she'll go there, but she just sitting on the sidelines on that one as far as her public statements go. And
I did want to mention
Parker. I was going to say Parker, though, did pick up an endorsement
an interesting endorsement. I just saw this on Facebook the other day. Adeem the artist, local, very well regarded country folk singer songwriter who has gotten a lot of attention this year. Has been out there recently touring with Jason Isbell and people of that caliber. And Adeem is a strong advocate for social justice. We ran a long interview with them actually earlier this year, which you can find on our website. And in that interview, Adeem was fairly critical of American Canon. Adeem came out on their Facebook page with a photo of Adeem and Amelia Parker standing together at the Perk City Coffee House in East Knoxville, and gave a strong endorsement to Parker. And so I think that it's just a sign that I think you will see a lot of the kind of, the more progressive social justice activist type folks in Knoxville certainly see Parker as their champion. And I think that's what the Adeem endorsement signifies, and I'm sure Parker was happy to have that support.
Yeah, and one thing that folks, of course, need to know is between now and the election, we will be running profiles on all the candidates and all of the races, and on our website, which is compassknox.com, and so we'll be getting into a lot of, their personalities, their policy prescriptions, various things about the election moving forward as we get closer to Election Day.
All right, real quick, guys, I got one more interruption question. It's going back just a second. I've had Chris Davis on my show a couple times and talked to him about some of the processes and all that kind of stuff. And so more on a procedural conversation, was there a challenge to Er's candidacy, or was that something the commission naturally does every time?
It was a standard review.
Okay.
And this one was a pretty easy one. Usually when disputes come up about whether somebody actually lives somewhere or not, it's, they have a house in one location and maybe an apartment or a condo somewhere else, and usually accusations that, well, they really don't spend time there. That was what several years ago, Richard Briggs, the state senator, that had come up that he had a condo close to the hospital where he works as a surgeon. So that was what he said, and there were accusations that he did not live there. It turned out that they determined that he did, or and so on. This one was a little bit easier to find out because he voted in November of last year using his county address, and that's supposed to be where your primary residence is. And so then he moved to inside the city, changed his address on his voter registration, and so they kind of had there's a paper trail,
right?
And also, as you might think, is, well, if he used his county, but he'd already moved to Knoxville, but used his county address, perhaps, well, in that case, it would have been voter fraud, and that would have been not so good. So, assuming that that the paperwork was in order, and I think, from talking to him, and I've talked to him, a couple of times, it's, I think that he genuinely thought that he would be able to run, he said that he kind of hinted that he might run again, and he said that next time I'll be better prepared. So,
okay.
But yeah, to answer your question, it was procedure. It was standard.
Right.
Yeah.
Understood. Thank you.
Let's take a look ahead to next week. We do have some meetings and agendas out there. The school board will hold its monthly meetings. It's a work session on Monday and its voting meeting on Thursday. Both of those at 5 p.m. In their Summer Place boardroom. There's one interesting thing on the agenda that I don't quite know all the background to, but I think there will be some discussion about it. Board member Steve Triplett has proposed cutting back to having just one school board meeting a month. So that would presumably mean getting rid of the work session, since they have to have a voting meeting. And so maybe looking at just trying to do everything in one voting meeting every month. I can imagine various logistical challenges with that. I mean, often the point of the work session is to talk through items that are on the agenda for the voting meeting so that they can have a full debate of them, and also allow, time to get more information and so forth before they have to vote on things. If you try to do all of that in one meeting, it could make for a very long meeting. It would also create a situation where there would just be less opportunity for the public to weigh in, because they have public forum sessions at both the work session and at the voting meeting. And so that would be cutting back opportunities for public input to once a month from twice. I don't know Triplett's exact reasonings behind this, but I imagine that there will be some discussion of it at the work session on Monday, because they are having a work session on Monday. So we'll see what happens there. And then, Scott, City Council is meeting on Tuesday, right?
City Council meets Tuesday. We were talking about gun violence earlier, and one of the things that they're going to vote on, it's routine. They'll all support this, I'm sure, but it's a $307,000 contract with the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform for group violence reduction. And by group violence reduction, that's essentially what a lot of people refer to as gang violence reduction. A lot of people think that a lot of inner city violence is driven by gang participation, and it there is a lot of that. One of the things I found out from talking to KPD last year was that we were talking about the landscape, and there are a lot of small gangs in Knoxville. There were basically two, east and west, and now that there are several, they're not as rigid as far as membership goes. Sometimes there's even free agency among some gangs in Knoxville, and not all violence, particularly the gun violence, is necessarily related to gang activity. A lot of times gang members get in personal disputes that have nothing really to do with their gang affiliation, but they get involved in them anyway. Things like that. But this grant, or it's not really a grant, it's a contract. The National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform will come in. That will help provide funding to build capacity for addressing violence among people who are affiliated with the city, with the Turn Up Knox and other community groups, and the police department. Is basically they're going to be identifying high risk individuals, either as perpetrators or victims of violent crime. Do engagement with them and try to nip it in the bud, but violence in the bud before it happens, which is aligned with what the city has talked about doing in its non-police response to violence, and then of course using law enforcement as a last resort rather than an early resort, rather than kind of make that your focus being really to keep people from committing violence. So that's going to come up. Like I said, it's a $307,000. It's not not an insignificant amount of money. It's not an exorbitant amount of money either for a city, but they're going to be doing that. One other interesting little note is Councilwoman Seema Singh is asking is put forward a resolution that would ask the Planning Commission to consider removing the requirement to get a special use review for duplexes in what are known as R2 zones. It's a residential zone, probably the most common residential zone in the city. This would address the missing middle housing that we've been talking about a lot lately. And it would just mean that if you live in an R2 zone or you own property in an R2 zone, you can just build a duplex the way you can now just go in and build a single family home as a right. As right now, you have to go to the planning commission and go through a use on review process. You have to pay them, fees to do that, and planning commission will decide whether you can or can't build a duplex on your property. One of the things that this resolution points out is that duplexes are never rejected in R2 zones. So why have this extra step put in anyway? As it happens, that will also be, that gives me a good way to segue into the planning commission meeting, which is on Thursday. And on Thursday, there are a couple of instances where people who are wanting to build duplexes they're asking for the planning commission to approve them use on review for these R2 zones. That if this resolution had been in effect, it was in effect now, they wouldn't need to go to the planning commission. One of them is kind of an interesting little thing. It's on Bruin Road, or just off Bruin Road, right by Inskip Pool, and it's actually the only residential property on the big square that is that city property. So it's but there's a developer there who wants to build a couple of duplexes there. Another one is on Francis Road, north of Bearden Middle School in the Amherst community, which is also happens to be the district where Singh is the representative. So and actually kind of close to where she lives. So this is one of those things that here, these are two prime examples of people who now have to go to planning commission and have to spend the extra money and time to go there. And whereas if Singh's resolution passed, and they end up, Singh's resolution is just the first step. It goes to planning commission for review. Then it would come back to city council as an ordinance change. But it would be, it would be a way to facilitate that more dense missing middle development in the city. And there's one other kind of notable thing the commission or the planning commission is looking at, and that is the property at 16th and Clinch is the former home of the Knoxville Center for Reproductive Health. Basically went out of business after the Dobbs decision in outlawing or removing the constitutional right to abortion, and of course Tennessee's trigger law that came into effect to basically outlaw abortion virtually every instance in the state. The center's closed down. The property's for sale. It's on the corner. It's on a pretty prominent corner, right close to. They may have actually been sold. I shouldn't say it's for sale. It may have already been sold, but it's pretty prominent location right off of Cumberland Avenue in the University of Tennessee campus, and they are wanting to rezone it to commercial. For commercial use right now, it's zoned for actually residential use, but the clinic conforms to that, or did conform to that. So it's going to be a commercial. There's no indication about what the plans are for the property. Whether they're going to tear down the existing building and build something new, they're going to put a business into that. Those details have not been released yet. But that's a kind of a notable change in the real estate landscape that came about because of the Dodds decision. So,
yep, true enough. All right. Well, we will be back next week to talk about all of those things and anything else that comes up. Thanks, as always, to Lord Seth Barber at Barbarian Productions for his fine work behind the boards. Our theme music is by Will Wright, and we will talk to you later.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.